The great hall of Ashfall Keep was a place of stone and silence. It was built to intimidate, with snarling wolves carved into the granite pillars and ancient tattered banners hanging from the high, shadowed rafters. On the throne of jagged iron and petrified wood sat Alpha King Kaelin, a man who seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as his hall. His presence was a physical weight, pressing down on the supplicants who shuffled forward, one by one, to beg for his favor. Ilara stood near the back, her small daughter Lyra, clutching her worn tunic. She was an Omega, the lowest of the low, and she expected nothing. She was here for a formality, a required appearance that only served to remind her of her place. Her place was in the dirt. It was in the cold, cramped Omega quarters where the scent of desperation clung to the damp walls. It was in the kitchens, scrubbing pots until her hands were raw, for the privilege of leftover scraps for her child. Ilara kept her head down, her eyes on the filthy floor. That was how Omegas survived. They made themselves small, they made themselves invisible. But it was hard to be invisible when your heart was beating outside your body, a 6-year-old girl with wide, curious eyes that missed nothing. "Mama, is that the king?" Lyra whispered, her voice a tiny bird's chirp in the oppressive silence. "Yes, little wolf," Ilara murmured back, stroking her daughter's tangled hair. "Now be quiet. We must not draw attention." But Lyra was not built for quiet. She was a spark of life in a world of grey. While Ilara watched the ground, Lyra watched the king. She saw the hard line of his jaw, the cold silver of his eyes, the immense power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. And she saw something else. A flicker of black beneath the edge of his ornate leather gauntlet as he shifted his hand on the armrest. A pattern that was deeply, strangely familiar. Before Ilara could react, Lyra let go of her tunic. She slipped through the crowd with the uncanny speed of a small child on a mission. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Guards stiffened, their hands flying to the hilts of their swords. Omegas did not approach the throne. Children certainly did not. It was a violation of every protocol, every tradition. Ilara's blood ran cold. "Lyra, no!" she hissed, but her voice was swallowed by the sudden, sharp tension in the air. 2 royal guards moved to intercept the small girl, their faces grim masks of duty. But the king's voice cut through the hall like shattering ice. "Stop!" He held up a hand, his gaze fixed on the tiny figure, now standing bravely at the foot of the dais. He did not look angry, he looked intrigued. The emotion was so foreign on his perpetually stoic face that it was more unsettling than rage would have been. Lyra, emboldened, did not hesitate. She pointed a small, grubby finger directly at the king's wrist. Her voice, clear and high, echoed in the cavernous space, each word a hammer blow against the silence. "That looks like Mama's." Confusion murmured through the crowd. The king's uncle, Lord Valerius, who stood at his right hand, took a half-step forward, his expression one of pure fury. "Child, you will hold your tongue!" But Lyra was not speaking to him. Her eyes were locked on the king. "My mama has the same mark as you." The world stopped. Every eye in the hall swiveled from the child to the Omega woman cowering at the back of the room. Ilara felt 1,000 stares piercing her like physical blows. She wanted the stone floor to swallow her whole. The mark, her secret shame. The ugly, thorny pattern that coiled around her own wrist, a blemish she had kept hidden under long sleeves her entire life. It was a brand of otherness, a defect she was told marked her as flawed, as less. King Kaelin's silver eyes found hers across the distance. There was no longer any intrigue in his gaze. There was only a raw, predatory intensity that stripped her bare. He rose from his throne. He was a mountain unfolding, a force of nature that commanded absolute submission. He descended the steps of the dais, his heavy boots echoing like a death knell on the stone. The crowd parted before him as if by magic, creating a direct path between the Alpha King and the terrified Omega. He did not stop until he was standing before her, so close she could feel the chill that seemed to radiate from his skin. He did not speak. He simply reached out, his large, calloused hand grasping her arm. His touch was like being branded with ice. With his other hand, he pushed back the frayed sleeve of her tunic, exposing the black, thorny vines tattooed into her flesh. It was a perfect mirror of the one partially hidden on his own wrist. A wave of shocked whispers washed over them. Lord Valerius's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. Kaelin ignored them all. His gaze was locked on the mark, then on her face. His voice, when it came, was not a request, it was a decree. A raw, possessive sound that bound her to him in that single, irrevocable moment. She comes with me. The declaration hung in the air, absolute and final. Lord Valerius surged forward, his face a tight knot of controlled rage. "Your Majesty, you cannot be serious. She is an Omega, a nobody. This is a coincidence, nothing more, a mockery." Kaelin's head turned slowly, and the look he gave his uncle could have frozen fire. "Are you questioning my command, Valerius?" The words were spoken softly, but they carried the lethal promise of a blade's edge. Valerius paled, bowing his head stiffly. "No, Your Majesty." Kaelin's attention returned to Elara. His grip on her arm was unbreakable. He pulled her forward, and she stumbled after him, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Lyra, seeing her mother being taken, ran and clung to Elara's leg, her small face buried in the rough fabric of her tunic. Kaelin glanced down at the child, his expression unreadable, before continuing his inexorable march out of the great hall, towing a broken Omega and her daughter in his wake. They were not led to the dungeons as Elara had feared. They were taken to the king's private wing, a part of the fortress so opulent it felt like another world. Gilded tapestries depicted ancient battles, plush carpets silenced their footsteps, and the air smelled of beeswax and old power. She and Lyra were shown into a suite of rooms that was larger than the entire Omega block. It had a soft bed with clean linens, a fireplace that was already crackling warmly, and a window that overlooked the royal gardens instead of a muddy alley. 2 guards were posted outside their door. They were not there for their protection. They were there to keep them in. They were prisoners in a gilded cage. Hours passed in suffocating silence. Lyra, exhausted by the day's events, fell asleep curled on the enormous bed. Elara sat in a velvet chair by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the mark on her wrist. What did it mean? Why did the most powerful Alpha in the kingdom share the same cursed brand as a worthless Omega? The door opened without a knock. King Kaelin entered, filling the room with his overwhelming presence. He had removed his crown and formal armor, dressed now in a simple black tunic and trousers that did little to hide the raw power coiled in his frame. He moved to the hearth, standing opposite her, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his harsh, handsome face. "I will not waste time with pleasantries," he began, his voice a low rumble. "You and your child will be cared for. You will want for nothing. Food, clothing, safety. It will all be provided." Elara found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Why? What do you want from me?" He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something beyond cold command in his eyes. It was a deep, desperate weariness. "I want to know what that mark is," he said, gesturing to her wrist. "Because this," he pushed up his own sleeve, revealing the full extent of the thorny pattern that snaked up his forearm, "is a curse. It is killing me." The confession was stark, brutal, and utterly unexpected. He was the Alpha King, a being of seemingly infinite strength. To hear him speak of weakness, of death, was like watching a mountain crumble. "It appeared 10 years ago," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a historical fact. "A small blemish. Now, it grows. It feeds on my strength, on my vitality. It leeches the warmth from my body and the power from my wolf. I have consulted every healer, every scholar, every hedge witch, from the Sunken Fens to the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. None of them could identify it. None of them could stop it." He took a step closer, his silver eyes boring into her. "And then your daughter points to the one thing that has been my secret torment for a decade and tells me her mother bears its twin. So you will tell me everything. Where did you get it? How long have you had it? What does it do?" Ilara shrank back. I was born with it. I don't know what it is. My mother said it was a bad omen, a sign of a weak bloodline. It has never done anything." She spoke the truth, a truth she had lived with her entire life. The mark was a part of her, a flaw, like a crooked tooth or a mismatched eye. It meant nothing. Kaelin's expression tightened with disappointment. He had clearly hoped for an easy answer. He paced before the fire, the restless energy of a caged predator radiating from him. Finally, he stopped and turned back to her. "For now, you will remain here. You will not speak to anyone about this. You will be observed." "If you are lying to me." He left the threat hanging in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear. He turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving Ilara alone with his terrifying secret and her own profound confusion. In the days that followed, Ilara and Lyra lived in a strange limbo. They were waited on by servants who treated them with a mixture of fear and disdain. They ate food more luxurious than anything Ilara had ever imagined, but they could not leave their rooms. Kaelin visited each evening. He was detached, clinical. He would ask her questions about the mark. Did it ever hurt? Did it ever change color? Did she feel anything from it? Her answer was always the same. No, nothing. It was just skin. He grew more frustrated with each visit. One evening, his control finally snapped. He slammed a fist against the stone mantelpiece, cracking the marble. "There must be something. It cannot be a coincidence." The outburst startled Lyra, who had been quietly drawing on a piece of parchment by the fire. She jumped up, dropping her charcoal stick, and ran to hide behind Ilara's chair. The sight of the child's fear seemed to lance Kaelin's anger. A look of self-disgust crossed his face. He took a deep, steadying breath, the moment of raw emotion gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Forgive me," he said, the words sounding stiff and unused on his tongue. He turned to leave, but then paused at the door. "Show me," he commanded, his voice low. Ilara was confused. "Show you what?" "The full extent of it, if yours truly is the same." He turned his back to her and pulled his tunic over his head. Ilara gasped. The thorny vines she had seen on his arm were only the beginning. They coiled up his entire torso, a nightmarish tapestry of black, venomous-looking thorns. The pattern was thickest over his heart, a dense, tangled knot that looked like a parasite feeding on him. The skin around the marks was unnaturally pale, almost grey, and she could feel the cold emanating from him even across the room. This was not a blemish, it was a blight, an infection of darkness consuming him from the inside out. She saw in that moment the truth of his words. He was dying. The great Alpha King, the wolf who commanded armies and ruled a nation, was being devoured by a secret shadow. A profound, unexpected wave of pity washed over her. For the first time, she did not see a king. She saw a man, trapped and desperate. A few days later, the sterile routine of their confinement was broken. Lyra, chasing a dust mote in a sunbeam, tripped on the edge of the carpet and fell, scraping her knee on the stone hearth. It wasn't a bad cut, but it was enough to make her cry out in pain and surprise. "Oh, my sweet girl," Ilara said, rushing to her side and scooping her up. She sat with Lyra on her lap, hushing her cries. "It's all right. Mama's here." Instinctively, without a single thought, she covered the bleeding scrape with her hand, her marked hand. She meant only to apply pressure, to comfort. But as her skin touched her daughter's, something happened. A warmth bloomed in her palm, a gentle, pulsing heat she had never felt before. It travelled up her arm, and the thorny mark on her wrist began to glow with a soft, emerald light, visible even through her skin. Lyra's crying stopped. She looked down, her eyes wide. "Mama, it's tickly!" Ilara pulled her hand away, stunned. The scrape was gone, not healing, not scabbed over. It was simply gone. The skin was smooth and unbroken, as if the injury had never happened. She stared at her hand, then at her daughter's perfect knee. Her heart hammered against her ribs. All her life, the mark had done nothing. It had been a passive, ugly thing. Until now, neither of them had noticed the door opening. King Cailan stood on the threshold, his eyes wide, fixed on Ilara's hand. He had seen the flash of green light. He had seen the impossible healing. He strode into the room, his usual cold composure shattered. He knelt before her, taking her hand in his. His touch was urgent, desperate. "Do that again," he commanded, his voice rough with a wild, burgeoning hope. I don't know how," she stammered. "I didn't do anything. It just happened." He looked from her hand to her face, and the vast, frozen landscape of his eyes began to thaw. The frustration, the anger, the despair, it was all replaced by a single, shining emotion. Awe. "You were wrong," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Your mark isn't a curse. All this time I've been searching for a cure, when the cure was a person." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a puzzle to be solved or a tool to be used, but as a miracle. "It's the opposite of mine. Mine is death. Yours is life." That moment changed everything. Cailan's visits became less like interrogations and more like something else, something gentler. He began to talk to her, not just about the curse, but about the kingdom, about his duties, about the crushing weight of the crown. He started bringing small things for Lyra, a beautifully carved wooden wolf, a handful of honeyed nuts from the royal kitchens, a picture book with colourful illustrations of mythical beasts. Lyra, with the guileless heart of a child, quickly grew to adore him. She would run to him when he entered, showing him her latest drawing or telling him a story. He was surprisingly patient with her, listening with a solemn intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Ilara watched these interactions with a growing sense of wonder. She was seeing a side of the fearsome Alpha King that she was certain no one else knew existed. His demeanor towards Ilara softened too. He started asking about her life before, about her parents, about the hardships she faced as an Omega. He listened, his jaw tight with anger when she spoke of the insults and the hunger. One afternoon, Lady Seraphina, a high-born she-wolf Valerius had been pushing as a potential mate for Kaelin, came to their chambers. Her visit was unannounced, an obvious power play. "So this is the king's new pet," Seraphina sneered, her eyes raking over Ilara's simple dress with contempt. "An Omega and her half-breed brat. How far the mighty have fallen." Before Ilara could respond, Kaelin's voice came from the doorway, cold as a winter storm. "Lady Seraphina," he had entered silently, "you are not welcome here." Seraphina flushed, turning to him with a simpering smile. "Your Majesty, I was just getting acquainted with your guest." "Ilara is not a guest," Kaelin stated, moving to stand beside Ilara, a possessive, protective arm coming to rest on the back of her chair. "She is under my personal protection, and you will address her with the respect she is due. If you ever speak to her or her daughter that way again, you will find yourself outside the castle walls before sunset. Am I understood?" The beautiful she-wolf's face turned white with rage and humiliation. She curtsied stiffly. "Perfectly, Your Majesty." She shot Ilara a look of pure venom before turning and fleeing the room. Ilara looked up at Kaelin, her heart doing a strange, fluttering dance in her chest. No one had ever defended her before. No one. "Thank you," she whispered. His gaze softened as it met hers. "No one will harm you here," he promised. "Not while I draw breath." His beta, a grim-faced warrior named Daxon, who had always looked at her with suspicion, was standing behind him in the hall. For the first time, Daxon met her eyes and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of grudging respect. The tide was turning. That night, Kaelin came to her rooms late. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. The curse was flaring up, a consequence of him pushing himself too hard during a border dispute. He collapsed into a chair, a low groan of pain escaping his lips. His hand went to his chest, where the heart of the curse lay. Without thinking, Ilara was at his side. "Let me help." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain. He nodded weakly. He pulled open the collar of his tunic, exposing the cold, cursed skin over his heart. Ilara knelt before him. She hesitated for only a second, then placed her marked hand directly over the tangled knot of black thorns. The connection was electric. It was nothing like healing Lyra's knee. This was a battle. She felt the cold, draining power of the curse, a malevolent presence that fought against her. She closed her eyes, focusing, pushing her own energy, the warm green light of life, into him. It was like pouring water onto a raging fire. Her mark blazed with power, a miniature sun against the darkness. It was an agony and an ecstasy, a torrent of power that left her feeling scoured and hollow, but she didn't stop. She could feel his pain receding, replaced by a wave of relief. The tension left his body, and his head slumped forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. His breathing evened out. The fight was over. She had pushed the curse back. It was not gone, but it was dormant, sleeping. The effort left her utterly spent. She felt dizzy, weak. Kaelin, sensing her fatigue, stirred. He opened his eyes, now clear and free of pain. He looked at her, his face inches from hers. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound gratitude, of desperate connection. It was hesitant, gentle, a question and an answer all in one. In that single, quiet touch, the last of the walls between them crumbled to dust. He was no longer just her king, and she was no longer just his healer. They were Kaelin and Ilara. He pulled back slowly, his eyes searching hers. He seemed dazed, as if waking from a long dream. He had not felt this good, this clear, this alive in a decade. He looked at the woman before him who had faced his darkness without flinching, who had given her own strength to ease his suffering. The instinct that had screamed at him in the great hall, the possessive urge to claim her, made sense. It wasn't just about the curse. His wolf had recognized her. His soul had recognized its other half. Exhaustion finally claimed him. He slumped against her, his great weight nearly pinning her to the floor. She managed to guide him towards the settee, where he collapsed, falling into a deep, peaceful sleep almost instantly. His head ended up in her lap. Ilara stayed there with him all night, her hand resting on his chest, her fingers intertwined with his. She watched him sleep, the harsh lines of his face smoothed away, looking younger, more vulnerable. And as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, she admitted a dangerous, impossible truth to herself. She was falling in love with the broken king. Their new intimacy did not go unnoticed. Lord Valerius watched them with narrowed, calculating eyes. Kaelin was getting stronger. The pallor was leaving his skin, the light was returning to his eyes. He was smiling, a rare and startling sight. He was spending more and more time with the Omega and her child. Valerius's meticulously laid plans were unraveling. The Omega Witch had to be removed. His first attempt was crude. He arranged for a training accident in the courtyard, a volley of arrows from a supposedly malfunctioning training dummy to be fired just as Kaelin and Ilara were walking by. But Kaelin's senses, sharpened by his returning strength and the burgeoning mate bond, screamed a warning. He threw himself and Ilara to the ground a split second before the arrows thudded into the stone wall where they had been standing. He knew it was no accident. His second attempt was more subtle. A servant, her family threatened by Valerius, brought a tray of tea to Ilara's rooms. It was laced with wolfsbane, a poison that would be slow and agonizing for a werewolf. Ilara was about to take a sip when Lyra, who was sitting beside her, wrinkled her nose. "Mama, that tea smells spiky," she said. Ilara paused. Spiky. It was a child's word, but it was enough. She remembered the thorny look of the curse, the feeling of malevolence. She looked at the servant, who couldn't meet her eyes, her hands trembling. Ilara understood. She thanked the servant and told her she would drink it later. As soon as the woman was gone, she threw the contents of the cup into the fire. The flames hissed and spat, turning a sickly green for a moment. Kaelin was furious. He doubled the guard on her rooms and had every meal tested. He knew who was behind it, but he had no proof. His own uncle, the man who had helped raise him, was trying to murder the woman who was saving his life. The betrayal was a cold knife in his gut. Valerius realized he was running out of time. He needed to make a final, decisive move. He orchestrated the murder of an emissary from the neighboring Silvermoon pack, using a rare, flesh-rotting poison that mimicked the visual effects of Kaelin's curse. He planted evidence in Kaelin's study. Then he called an emergency meeting of the Pack Council. He stood before the council elders, his face a mask of sorrow and grim duty. "It is with a heavy heart that I bring this news," he began, his voice resonating with false grief. "The king's affliction. It is not just killing him, it is twisting his mind. He has become paranoid, violent. He murdered the Silvermoon emissary in a fit of rage." He presented the evidence, a dagger from Kaelin's collection, a witness who was paid to lie. Panic and fear spread through the council. They had all seen the king's health improve, but Valerius twisted it. "The Omega Witch is not healing him. She is feeding his power, making him more volatile. He is a danger to us all," he thundered. "For the good of the pack, I must insist he be deposed. A regency must be established until this madness passes." Kaelin, summoned to the council chamber, listened to the accusations, his face like stone. He knew it was a lie, but the council was wavering, his word against his trusted uncle's. Ilara had been barred from the meeting, but she felt the shift in the keep's atmosphere. A cold dread washed over her. She pressed her hand to the chamber door, trying to feel what was happening inside. As she focused, a strange thing happened. The world dissolved into a dizzying vortex of images. Her mind was thrown back in time. She saw a younger Valerius, his face contorted with ambition and jealousy, leaning over a sleeping teenage Kaelin. In Valerius's hand was a shard of obsidian, dripping with a black, viscous substance. He pressed it to Kaelin's chest. The curse. It was him. He had done this. The vision ended, leaving her gasping and shaking. It was a side effect of her power, a flash of insight, of truth. She knew what she had to do. She burst into the council chamber. "He's lying!" she cried out, pointing a trembling finger at Valerius. "He's the one who cursed Kaelin! I saw it!" Valerius laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "The ramblings of a mad Omega! Seize her!" His loyal guards moved forward, but Kaelin stepped in front of Ilara, shielding her with his body. "You will not touch her." The standoff was absolute. The council was in chaos. Valerius saw his chance. This was the moment. "You see, he defends the witch over his own council. He is lost to us." He drew a hidden blade from his sleeve, its edge coated in the same poison that killed the emissary. "I do this for the good of the pack." He lunged, not at Kaelin, but at Ilara. But Kaelin was faster. He shoved her aside, taking the blow himself. The blade sliced deep into his shoulder. The poison was potent, and combined with the curse, Valerius's proximity was agitating. Kaelin staggered, a cry of pain torn from his throat. The curse flared across his skin, black and angry. Valerius smiled, triumphant. His guards closed in around the wounded king. It was over. He had won. "No," a soft voice said. Ilara stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a power no one had ever seen in her before. She was no longer a frightened Omega. She was a force of nature. She walked through the circle of guards, who fell back from her as if she were wreathed in flame. She went to Kaelin, who was on one knee, struggling to fight the poison and the curse. She placed her hands on his chest. "I can fix this," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone. "But you have to trust me. You have to let go." He looked into her eyes, and, in their depths, he saw not fear, but absolute certainty. He saw his mate, his queen. He nodded, surrendering his fate to her. Ilara closed her eyes. She reached deep inside herself, past the fear and the doubt, and took hold of the core of her power. She pulled. She didn't just soothe the curse. She didn't just push it back. She ripped it out. A blinding emerald light erupted from her, throwing everyone in the room back. The mark on her arm blazed, and the thorny pattern extended, crawling over her own skin, a mirror of the one on Kaelin. But where his was black and dead, hers was a light with vibrant green life. She was taking the curse into herself, absorbing his poison, his pain, his decade of suffering. The agony was indescribable. It felt like being torn apart, molecule by molecule. A scream was ripped from her throat, raw and full of pain. Kaelin roared. He felt the curse leave him, a physical tearing sensation, like an anchor being ripped from his soul. 10 years of cold, of weakness, of encroaching death vanished in an instant. A tidal wave of strength, of pure, untainted alpha power flooded through him. His wolf, suppressed for so long, surged to the surface, its rage absolute. He saw Ilara, his mate, sacrificing herself for him, her body convulsing as the darkness he had carried for so long tried to claim her instead. The love he felt for her, the final, unbreakable snap of the fated mate bond, was a physical explosion in his chest. Valerius, stunned by the display of raw magic, raised his blade to strike the now vulnerable Ilara. But he never made it. Cailan was a blur of motion, a black-furred whirlwind of claws and teeth. The fight was not a fight. It was an execution. The full, unrestrained power of a healthy Alpha King was a terrifying thing to behold. It was over in seconds. Valerius lay broken and defeated on the floor. Cailan shifted back, his human form radiating power and fury. He ignored his uncle, ignored the stunned council. He had eyes only for her. He rushed to Ilara's side just as she collapsed, her body overwhelmed, the war between the curse's darkness and her life-giving light raging within her. He gathered her into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, and held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. For 3 days she did not wake. She lay in the king's own bed, pale and still. The black thorny marks had appeared on her skin, a faint tracery warring against the silver of her own birthmark. Cailan never left her side. He held her hand, pouring his own boundless, newly restored strength into her, channeling the power of their now unbreakable bond to help her fight. He willed her to live, refusing to accept any other outcome. He had just found her. He would not lose her. On the morning of the 4th day, her eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was his face, etched with worry and sleeplessness, watching her. "Cailan?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Relief, so profound it was painful, washed over him. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "I'm here, Ilara. I'm here." She looked down at her arm. The black marks were gone. All that remained was her original birthmark, but it was no longer an ugly blemish. It was a delicate, shimmering silver, like threads of woven moonlight. She felt whole. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He finally let go of the control he had held for a decade, and the words poured out of him. He told her about his fear, about the cold despair that had been his only companion. He told her how her daughter's courage had lit a spark of hope in his frozen heart. And he told her he loved her, that his soul had recognized her from the moment she stood defiant in the great hall. "You are my mate, Ilara, my Luna, my queen, if you will have me." Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy and relief. "Yes," she whispered. "Always, yes." A week later, the great hall was filled once more. But this time the atmosphere was not one of fear, but of celebration. Lord Valerius, stripped of his titles and power, had been exiled to the barren lands of the north, a fate worse than death. Cailan stood on the dais, no longer a cold, distant ruler, but a vibrant, powerful king, his silver eyes warm and full of life. Beside him stood Ilara, not in an Omega's rags, but in a gown of silver silk that matched her mark. Lyra stood between them, holding both their hands, a princess in all but name. "Today we heal the wounds of the past," Cailan announced, his voice ringing with authority and joy. "We cast out the shadows of betrayal and embrace a new dawn." He turned to Ilara, taking her hand. "I present to you, Ilara, my fated mate, your Luna Queen." He leaned down and, in front of the entire pack, He marked her, sinking his teeth gently into the crook of her neck, sealing their bond for eternity. A wave of power, of acceptance, of pure joy washed over the assembled pack. They roared their approval, a single, unified voice. Daxon, his beta, was the first to drop to one knee, followed by every other wolf in the hall, their heads bowed in deference to their new queen. 6 months later, Elara stood on the balcony of their chambers, looking out over a kingdom that was thriving under its revitalized king and his compassionate queen. She rested a hand on her gently swelling belly, a new life growing within her, a product of their impossible love. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and Kaelin's chin came to rest on her shoulder. He placed his hand over hers, on her stomach. "I never thought I would see another spring," he murmured into her hair. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved, my love." She turned in his arms, her heart full. "We saved each other." He smiled, the expression still new enough to make her heart skip a beat, and lowered his head to kiss her. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures bright, a testament to the quiet Omega who had healed a broken king. Theirs was a bond forged in the shadow of a curse, a love that had proven stronger than any darkness, a light that would guide their pack for generations to come.